A century-old energy giant just walked away from one of America's most valuable markets. Phillips 66 didn't go bankrupt. They posted $7 billion in profit. Yet in October 2025, they processed their final barrel of crude oil at their Los Angeles refinery and shut the doors on 106 years of California history. But here's what nobody's talking about. This wasn't just a business decision. This was the climax of a brutal war between Big Oil and Sacramento that's been brewing for years. And if you think this story ends with one refinery closure, you're missing the bigger picture. Before we dive deep into what really happened here, hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel breaks down the economic battles that shape your everyday life. And trust me, what happened in California is coming to your state next. Let's start with what California actually lost here, because the numbers tell a story politicians don't want you to hear. The Phillips 66 facilities in Wilmington and Carson weren't just any refineries. These plants sat 15 miles from LAX, the fifth busiest airport on Earth. Every single day, 88 million passengers flow through that airport annually, and guess what powered those planes? Phillips 66 was producing 65,000 barrels of jet fuel daily. That's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. That's cargo planes hauling electronics from Asia. That's commercial jets carrying families to vacation. That's the invisible infrastructure that makes modern life possible. But it gets bigger. This refinery was cranking out 85,000 barrels of gasoline every single day. To put that in perspective, that represented roughly 8% of California's entire refining capacity. Gone. Just like that. And location? The facility sits right next to the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest port in the entire Western Hemisphere. Think about the fuel demands there. Container ships, trucks running 24/7, cranes are moving goods from Asia to American store shelves. All of it runs on diesel and gasoline. Even CEO Mark Lashier acknowledged this in corporate speak. He called the property unique and strategically located near the port. Translation: we're sitting on a gold mine, and we're still choosing to leave. So when a company walks away from that kind of strategic position, when they abandon infrastructure that literally powers one of the world's major economic hubs, you need to ask yourself, what could possibly make that decision make sense? Here's where the story gets interesting, because California didn't just lose this refinery. California pushed it out. Let me take you back to June 2022. Gas prices in California hit $6.43 per gallon. Some stations crossed $7. Meanwhile, the national average sat comfortably under $5. What was happening? Refineries were shutting down for maintenance without adequate fuel stockpiles, and prices exploded. Then it happened again in September 2023. Prices spiked to $6.80 per gallon, with some LA stations hitting $6.70. California's energy regulators investigated and found a pattern. Refineries going offline, supply dropping, prices skyrocketing, and oil companies banking massive profits during the chaos. That 2023 price spike alone cost California drivers an estimated $2.2 billion in excess fuel costs. Sacramento saw blood in the water and decided to act. On October 14, 2024, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 1X into law. This wasn't your typical regulatory tweak. This was the state government seizing unprecedented control over private industry operations. The law gave California regulators the power to dictate how much gasoline refineries must keep in storage at all times. It also allowed the state to control when refineries could shut down for maintenance. The state called these price spikes exactly what they suspected them to be: manufactured profit opportunities. They accused refineries of deliberately creating shortages to jack up prices, and they decided to strip that power away. The U.S. oil industry's response was swift and brutal. 48 hours after Newsom signed that bill, Phillips 66 dropped their bombshell announcement. The Los Angeles refinery would close permanently. A facility that had survived 106 years of American history would be shut down within months. Of course, Phillips 66 insisted this was a pure coincidence. Their spokesperson delivered carefully crafted corporate language about multiple factors, long-term sustainability, and market dynamics. Not one word about the new law, not one mention of Sacramento, just business as usual, they claimed. But California Fuels and Convenience Alliance, the industry group representing refiners, had been warning legislators for months. They told Sacramento explicitly, pass this law and refineries will leave the state. Assembly Republican leader James Gallagher didn't mince words. He blamed Newsom's showboating and incompetence for killing hundreds of jobs while guaranteeing higher gas prices for WARP, California drivers. The California Energy Commission? They called it progress. A spokesperson actually praised the closure as a step forward in California's move to cleaner energy. They commended Phillips 66 for its commitment to minimize impacts on Californians. Let me translate what that commitment actually means. Phillips 66 promised to keep supplying California with gasoline, but not by producing it in-state. They'll import it, buy it from somewhere else, ship it in, and sell it to you. The state government called this a creative solution. That's how Sacramento described eliminating 8% of the state's gasoline production capacity. But the October announcement wasn't the beginning of Phillips 66's war with California. It was the final chapter in a conflict that had been escalating for years. And there's one piece of this story that barely made headlines, even though it reveals exactly the kind of company California was dealing with. Did you know a California judge called Phillips 66 reprehensible? Those were his exact words from the bench. He described them as an oil and gas behemoth that abused its power. This wasn't activist rhetoric. This was a formal court ruling. Phillips 66 was ordered to pay $833 million, not for an oil spill, not for pollution, not for safety violations, for stealing trade secrets from a small Sacramento company and using those secrets to build a billion-dollar business. This ranks as one of the 5 largest trade secret verdicts in American legal history. Here's what happened. In 2017, Phillips 66 approached a small renewable fuels company called Propel Fuels. Propel had spent 13 years grinding away, building a renewable fuels business from nothing. They knew how to navigate California's complex low-carbon fuel market. They had proprietary technology, customer data, strategic locations, and established relationships with state regulators. Everything Phillips 66 needed to compete in California's green energy future. Phillips expressed interest in acquiring Propel. They signed a confidentiality agreement. Propel, believing they were negotiating in good faith, opened their books and handed over 13 years of trade secrets and proprietary business intelligence. Then, in August 2018, Phillips killed the deal. No warning, no real explanation. They just walked away on a Friday morning. The following Monday, Phillips 66 told California regulators they were launching their own renewable fuels business, using a remarkably similar model to everything Propel had just shown them. Propel sued. The case went to trial in 2024. The jury found Phillips 66 guilty of willful and malicious trade, secret theft. They awarded Propel $65 million in compensatory damages. Then the judge tacked on an additional $228 million in punitive damages, bringing the total judgment to $833 million. This is the company that claims they left California purely for market reasons. But the trade secrets case was just one front in a larger war. California has been systematically making it more expensive to refine gasoline in the state for years, and they're not subtle about it. California operates something called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. It's elegantly simple and devastatingly expensive. Every year, the gasoline you sell has to be cleaner than the year before. By 2030, refiners must cut their fuel's carbon content by 20% compared to 2010 levels. Can't hit your targets? You buy credits from companies that produce cleaner fuel. Think of it as paying a fine for not being green enough. And those credits aren't cheap. They fluctuate with market demand, and when multiple refiners are scrambling to meet mandates, prices spike. Then there's California's cap-and-trade program. Every ton of carbon dioxide released, every emission from the refining process carries a price tag. Refiners must purchase allowances for their greenhouse gas emissions, and those costs get passed through the entire supply chain. Industry analysts estimate these environmental programs add roughly 54 cents to every gallon of gasoline produced in California. That's 54 cents that has nothing to do with crude oil costs, nothing to do with labor or equipment maintenance, just the regulatory cost of doing business in California. Phillips 66 tried to adapt. They converted their Rodeo refinery in the San Francisco Bay Area into a renewable fuels facility. Instead of gasoline, it now produces renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. They shut down their Santa Maria refinery in 2023. The Los Angeles closure makes 3 California facilities that Phillips 66 has either closed or converted in just 5 years. They're not adapting anymore, they're retreating. And here's the thing. The century-old refinery infrastructure needed massive upgrades to meet increasingly strict pollution standards. Replacing critical equipment like coke drums was estimated to cost between $400 million and $600 million for a facility that was already less profitable than refineries in regions like the U.S. Gulf Coast. That kind of capital investment didn't make economic sense. Now let's talk about what Phillips 66 is leaving behind, because this is where the story gets really ugly. For nearly 40 years, starting in the mid-20th century, workers at the refinery buried industrial waste directly on site. Slop oil, acid sludge, toxic chemicals from firefighting foam. They just dumped it in the ground. Back then, environmental regulations were virtually non-existent. Nobody asked questions. Decades later, state environmental records show that contamination is still there, leaching into the soil and groundwater. Lead contamination, PFAS chemicals. The legacy of a century of industrial operations. Phillips 66 has set aside $70 million for groundwater cleanup. That sounds substantial until you realize we're talking about 650 acres of contaminated industrial land. Environmental engineers will tell you that $70 million won't come close to addressing the full scope of contamination. Someone, likely California taxpayers, will be funding that cleanup for decades. But here's the silver lining for Phillips 66. That 650-acre site near the Port of Los Angeles is extraordinarily valuable real estate. The company is already working with land development firms to repurpose the property. Potential uses include an oil terminal, warehousing, or other industrial applications that don't involve refining. So Phillips 66 exits the refining business, avoids hundreds of millions in upgrade costs, avoids the ongoing regulatory headaches, and still monetizes one of the most strategically located industrial properties in Southern California. From a pure business perspective, it's almost brilliant. Let's not forget the real people caught in the middle of this corporate and political chess match. Approximately 600 Phillips 66 employees lost their jobs when the refinery shut down. Another 300 contractors who depended on that facility for work also found themselves unemployed. These weren't abstract statistics. These were skilled refinery workers, many of whom had spent entire careers at those facilities. Some were second or third generation refinery employees, following their parents and grandparents into the industry. Governor Newsom's office talked about California's transition to a clean energy future. They pointed to the 2035 mandate requiring all new cars sold in California to be zero-emission vehicles. They spoke about moving beyond fossil fuels as if the transition were already complete. But those 900 workers aren't living in 2035. They're living in 2026, facing unemployment in an industry that's contracting across California. Retraining programs and clean energy job promises don't pay mortgages today. Republican legislators hammered this point repeatedly. They argued that Newsom's aggressive environmental policies were destroying working-class jobs while driving up costs for ordinary Californians who still need to drive gasoline-powered cars for at least another decade. So what happens now? California just lost 8% of its refining capacity. The state's response has been remarkably confident, some might say overconfident. Phillips 66 is committed to continuing to supply the California market, but they're not producing that fuel in California anymore. They're importing finished gasoline and diesel, likely from refineries on the Gulf Coast or even internationally. The company's Rodeo Renewable Energy Complex, converted from a traditional refinery, now produces renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. But the production volumes don't replace what the Los Angeles refinery was producing. Basic economics tells you what happens when you reduce supply while demand remains relatively constant. Prices increase. California already has the highest gas prices in the continental United States. Removing 8% of refining capacity won't help. The state argues that demand is falling anyway. They point to rising electric vehicle adoption, improved public transportation, and changing commuter patterns. And they're not entirely wrong. Gasoline demand in California has been trending downward for years. But the transition isn't happening fast enough to offset this supply loss. California still has millions of gasoline-powered vehicles on the road. Those vehicles will need fuel for years, possibly decades, as the fleet slowly turns over. The risk is a supply crunch. If another refinery experiences unplanned downtime, if there's a disruption in fuel imports, California could see price spikes that make 2022 and 2023 look mild by comparison. And this time, there's less domestic refining capacity to ramp up production to meet the shortfall. Here's what you need to understand. This story isn't really about one refinery closure. It's about the collision between aggressive climate policy and economic reality. It's about what happens when a state government decides it can regulate an industry into the future it wants without fully accounting for the transition costs. California is conducting an experiment. They're attempting to force an energy transition faster than market forces alone would drive it. They're using regulations, mandates, and financial penalties to make fossil fuel production increasingly expensive and difficult, betting that clean energy alternatives will scale up fast enough to fill the gap. Maybe they're right. Maybe 10 years from now, California's energy grid will be powered overwhelmingly by renewables. Maybe the roads will be filled with electric vehicles. Maybe the transition will be remembered as visionary leadership. Or maybe California ends up dependent on imported fuel from states with looser environmental standards, effectively outsourcing their emissions rather than eliminating them. Maybe energy costs spiral high enough to drive middle-class families out of the state. Maybe businesses relocate to regions where energy is cheaper and more reliable. Phillips 66 survived 2 world wars. They made it through the Great Depression. They weathered oil embargoes, corporate mergers, earthquakes, and recessions. What they couldn't survive was Sacramento. CEO Mark Lashier called it market dynamics and long-term uncertainty. And technically, he's right. But those market dynamics were created by deliberate policy choices. That uncertainty was manufactured by a state government that changed the rules of the game so dramatically that a century-old facility became economically unviable almost overnight. So who won this fight? Phillips 66 is out, but they're monetizing valuable real estate and avoiding regulatory headaches. California is moving toward its clean energy goals, but fuel supplies are tighter and prices are likely to climb. 900 workers lost their jobs. Consumers are stuck with the bill. And there's a 650-acre toxic site that will require decades of cleanup. You decide who came out ahead. But here's the real question. Is this model sustainable? Can California force an energy transition through regulatory pressure alone? Or does it need a more balanced approach that accounts for economic realities and transition costs? Other states are watching closely. Some see California as a leader in climate policy, blazing a trail others will follow. Others see California as a cautionary tale of government overreach and the law of unintended consequences. One thing is certain: the battle between energy production and environmental regulation is far from over. California just fired one of the loudest shots in that ongoing war. The Phillips 66 closure isn't an ending. It's a preview of conflicts to come in states across America. If you found this breakdown valuable, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the economic battles shaping your world. Drop a comment below. Do you think California made the right call, or are they about to learn a painful lesson about energy policy? I'll see you in the next